This episode is such a love letter to hospitality, just beyond restaurants, right? Like you see the newspapers and the sports teams and even the little diners, not anything fine dining, but like it mirrors what you heard Sydney talking about with her dad. Like you serve the community. And seeing that Will Guidara was a producer, yep, right here on this one, co-producer, I guess, makes sense. Because for those that don't know, in his Unreasonable Hospitality book, he will often talk about case studies or he talks to businesses now, I think in a consulting capacity, where he uses some of the lessons from 11 Madison Park and talks about like, hey, in your barbershop or in your sports complex, how you can take some of these principles and deliver an amazing guest experience to people. All right, first, P. Tendrils in the Cambro shot to pause and talk about my Watching the Bear starter pack I've got today. So I got on the original beef from Dreamland shirt from friend of the show. I went on his podcast. He has a Seattle restaurants podcast named Sid. They did a pop-up at a place here in the city called Dreamland. And as I was leaving, he was like, hey, I know you do the bear stuff. Would you like a t-shirt? And so I was like, yes, thank you. I will wear this in a future video. So shout out to Sid for that. I also have from the friends at Tillet and Cambro, I have the Tillet Cambro cup complete with the straw. This is filled with ice. And for those longtime viewers of the Emulsion podcast, before that ended up rebranding, I have today's beverage, which is a new tonic wild citrus. Shout out to those guys for making a banger alternative to a sugar-free Red Bull. So I'm going to crack that and pour that and sip that as we enjoy episode 2. I know this tastes good. You can think of it as lemonade because I know that the way that this looks, it is not the most appealing on camera. It's the complete silence of this scene that I think is so telling. The hood's not on. Nobody's having conversations. Carmen just gets to focus. Door. A couple elements on screen here that I did touch on in episode 1. I'm going to have that linked. I'm not going to rehash that here, talking about the labels, talking about the Bain Marie. There's a couple elements of station construction here that is worth digging into further. First up is the knife placement here on the cutting board. And so you'll notice that this ends up being a home for a lot of chefs where their knife returns to at the top of the cutting board. And there's 3 kind of like constraints that led to this specific placement of the knife on the cutting board. So the first one is Carmen is right-handed. And so the handle facing towards, it's like the least amount of distance that hand has to travel to pick up the knife and put it into position to slice or carve something. The second constraint is the way that the blade is facing on the board. So you'll see that the blade part, the sharp part, is facing away from Carmen. So that makes it so that regardless of what he puts on that cutting board, regardless of the blade profile of the knife, if the tip is maybe slightly up from the cutting board or the heel of the knife is up, any part of the edge that could be a safety risk is basically mitigated by this placement. And thirdly, it's up at the top because most often than not, when you're working a station, you have a sort of flow that happens or a traffic zone that happens on your cutting board where you'll take something that is unprocessed. Let's say you're carving lamb. You're going to put that tray of lamb on the left side of your cutting board. You're going to take the lamb. You're going to put it onto your cutting board. You're going to slice it. And then you might have a stack of clean trays that you're going to actually pass up to the pass on the right side of your station. And so by placing your knife at the top of the board ensures that that traffic zone can stay clear. And then you don't have to worry about kind of like, oh, I put the knife on the right side of the cutting board. But then when I went to go, kind of move that piece of lamb, I knocked my knife and it fell off the cutting board or something stupid like that. I have worked with folks who likes to set up their station where that traffic zone works in kind of an L shape. And so you kind of do unprocessed things on the left and then the processed stuff goes up on the top of the cutting board. And then that right side of your station is used with like a towel or something. And then all your knives go there because that is actually where your right hand goes. And if you're setting up a station where the cutting board is up against a wall or up against a piece of equipment like an oven, it can make sense to do alternative setups here. But the most important thing here is to have a strategy in mind when you're setting up your station. 2 more elements to touch on. The first one is a quick one. It's the folded towels that we're seeing on screen here, and that kind of mirrors a lot of the like cut tape, philosophy here, where the edge of a tape being ripped or the handwriting being bad, that's like such an easy visual call out of chaos and disorder. If you were to have a puree splotched towel and it's just kind of balled up and thrown on the station, that looks a little bit less aesthetically pleasing and organized than a towel that is, relatively clean or it's at least rinsed through and it's folded up, knolled along the side of your cutting board on your station. It's nice to have 2 just as kind of like an oven mitt kind of thing. You have 2 hands, and so if you're lifting like a heavy sheet tray of something, being able to have 2 grippy points of being able to make sure that you can hold something hot and heavy is important with 2 towels. There's also a philosophy of having 1 wet, 1 dry, and so you have kind of a wipe towel. You'll often see wipe towels in kind of like sanitization solution buckets in kitchens, but like Carmen is just working by himself here. None of this is getting probably served to guests. And the third element that I don't think I've broken down yet are these metal containers here. These are called yakumi pans. These are one of those like Japanese these utilitarian, you know, kind of pieces of equipment that have kind of gotten co-opted by tasting menu restaurants because of the amount of components that often go into certain dishes. And the idea is that you keep all of the components for that dish siloed to one yakumi pan. And so you have the big pan, but then all the individual ones inside kind of have either a genre of product or it is associated with a dish. And so an example might be all of our powders, because we dust certain things. You're working on a pastry station and you have a raspberry powder and you have a tarragon powder and you have a citrus zest powder. All of those powders are relegated to the yakumi pan, and then you can put a lid on it and store it for tomorrow or something like that. Or it's this idea of all of the individual components for this pea dish. So the herb garnish and the diced, you know, turnip, all of those things go into the yakumi pan. And yes, they might have, you know, pickle liquid on them, or I might have dressed them, you know, just before service, but that helps you really organize yourself and have, like, there's some beautiful setups that you can create with yakumi pans because everything is kind of self-contained. There's obvious kind of capacity concerns of the scale that they're working at the Bear and the, you know, multiple courses that they're doing on the tasting menu. If you put something in here, it's like you probably can get like at least 20 portions of something maybe in one single yakumi pan, depending on what it is. And so you, as the person running the station, you might just have it in your mind that, like, okay, I'm just going to constantly check the tray here, and if I need to refill something, I'll go in my lowboy, grab the deli container out that might be, you know, like a quart of something, and I'll pour more into the yakumi pan that's going to extend, you know, the runway that I have on this specific component for the person that's at the pass. I'm also a big fan of organizing yourself this way because you can almost make sure that you don't forget components on a dish, especially in a tasting menu. If you change the tasting menu often, it can become this thing of like, did I put everything on this plate up? And you can even do an order of operations in the yakumi pan where it's like, okay, we're going to start with this component, and then we put the, you know, seared cauliflower on, and then we add all these other garnishes, and it just goes in order of the way that the pan is set up. It's a super easy way to make sure that everybody's on the same page with the plate up. It's just nice to have things, you know, like compartmentalized during the R&D process. Sure, he could use deli containers, but even circular containers on your station take up more space just to the way that the shapes kind of like nest next to one another. Having something that's rectangular makes sure that Carmen can achieve TSD here.
Micro radish. Fridge?
Yes, please. You break that box down?
Yup. Why are these micros so expensive?
Because they're micro.
Not a very satisfying answer. Let's talk about microgreens for a second. So they are either offshoot varietals, or they're actually just the young sprouting versions of exactly whatever they're called. And so radish microgreens, broccoli sprouts, tiny pea tendrils, any of these things will go on to become, you know, the full life cycle of the plant. They will flower, they will have the big root structure, they will bear fruit or go to seed, any of those things. But what the farmer or the person who is cultivating these microgreens is doing is kind of very systematically laying out trays of the seeds, putting them under some sort of UV light, which does take infrastructure because you're not just planting seeds outside and saying, hey, I'm going to let the, you know, birds peck at these. So you have to, there is a little bit of, you know, additional cost that the person who's producing these has to bear. But then also there's a timeliness. Like, you have to get the microgreens just at the right time. There's restaurants that I've worked at where it's like you wanted the micro cilantro to be like this specific size. And if it was a little bit too big, then that was something that we unfortunately couldn't use for that dish. And, you know, maybe it required a little bit of additional labor for us to cut those leaves in half or something like that. And so it does require a little bit more attention. And then thirdly, like, they're just little baby plants. Like, they don't have the lignin that's produced enough to make sure that the plant itself has enough structure to last long enough in the same way that like a big bunch of cilantro might. And so any little bruise, any sort of like incorrect temperature exposure, whether that's too hot or too cold, is going to make this little microgreen effectively become unusable. So you'll see chefs do little things. I think even in this pea tendril box, like, Carmen has a paper towel probably wet a little bit in the bottom of this container to make sure that you're preserving the life of these ingredients that you're bringing in. But yeah, the nice part about certain microgreens is that, like, when you get them into the restaurant, they're like ready to use. You don't have to do a bunch of additional washing or picking. Just take the box when it comes in. It's ready to use for service. There are certainly restaurants who kind of overuse microgreens, and every single dish has microgreens on it just because, like, this is a very brown dish and we needed to add a pop of color on it. Or, you know, I've heard that in restaurants of like, what's the green on this? Also, because the plant is relatively young, it hasn't had the time to produce enough chemicals to be like overly bitter, super spicy. So you can kind of have the delicate flavor profile of something like a radish in a radish microgreen that you can add to a dish in a more delicate way than having it be this big kind of like punch on your palate.
Morning. What's this?
All right, because I've seen this full episode, I know that this list of non-now negotiables, as we look at Carmen's handwriting, ends up being quite the point of contention for this episode. And so we'll pause right here. I'll pop them up on screen in a maybe more legible way, and we can talk about this list that Carmen made. And maybe a good place to start is the fact that like this is a version 1 of this idea and this concept. And Carmen, all of the learnings and experiences that we saw in episode 1 of this season are being brought to this list. And he's thinking about, kind of like, what do I want this to look like? What do I want the culture to be in this organization? I've been a part of these conversations in companies that I've been on the leadership team of and owners of, and this is really hard work. What stood out to me about this list, and I think one of the reasons that Carmen has such a hard time getting buy-in with this list, is because I see that what this non-negotiables list to be is a combination of values and rules. You can maybe reframe rules in a more positive way to say constraints, but you can quickly do a frustrating exercise for yourself here and put each hat on and then go through this list and try it for yourself. So put the values hat on and say, like, is this a list of values? And you're going to kind of get stuck with things like no repeat ingredients. You know what I mean? Like, what's the underlying value there? And then you can put the rules hat on and be like, okay, I understand the rule of no repeat ingredients, but like I get to confidence and competence and like, what's the rule there? How do I adhere to that rule? So I'll pop up on screen something I got when I was hired at Thomas Keller's restaurant group at the French Laundry. And this is his core values at the entire restaurant group. So regardless of the property that you're at, these are the core values. And what I found, having done some of these exercises with like brand identity specialists who walk you through some of these things, is that it's important to land on like, what do you mean by that word? So you might, like a perfect example is the one at the top of this list, modesty. Like, what do you mean by modesty? So this one's perfect. It says work towards achieving greatness, but with humility. Another way that plays out here is like you look at consistency and you're like, wait, consistency, the menu at the French Laundry changes every day. And you look at the subtitle and you say, oh, I understand the standards of quality is what's consistent. Like the menu and the product itself might change day to day, but it's like the what's consistent. What do I mean by consistency? I've started to become more and more a fan of, if you're going to adhere to something like a non-negotiable style attitude to your values, or use it in ways where you're going to like sit across the table from someone that's in an interview and you're going to say, these are non-negotiables that this person has to display or embody. I find that it's better to, like see and challenge yourself to come up with a list of 3 things that, again, are those non-negotiables. And what I find in the challenge of trying to get your values down to just 3 is that you can kind of sometimes take things and combine them in ways that, again, you get that little subtitle, or it allows you to explain things with more clarity. Looking at Carmen's list here, the confidence and competence and the know your shit line, like those are kind of the same thing. It's the same thing with like consolidation and speed. Less is more. Like, okay, cool. What do I mean by consolidation speed? What I mean is less is more, like as you're explaining that to like a new employee. Because what I've certainly found is that as the leadership team, you have the ability when the list is smaller to repeat those, to, really infuse those into things, to remind people like this is an example of one of our values. And then on the employee side, it's like you don't have this long, exhaustive list of things. And just to kind of prove it to you on how this develops for people, I pulled this out. This is like a super old book that I have. It's actually the really cool, I think it's German or Swiss, photographer and author. They did this book that was one day at the French Laundry and one day at Per Se. And so this actually has 2 sides. So it has, a bunch of, dish ideas and menu stuff of Per Se. So it's a full documentation of a day at the restaurant at Per Se. And then you flip the book upside down because they're different, places. And then this one is actually a day at French Laundry and the paper is different. And so this is more of a farmhouse, matte, paper. It's almost like the paper that you paint watercolor on. And then this one, because it's Per Se and it was, in the flashy, New York City, it's the glossy paper. And so what I found as I was looking through this is Thomas Keller's like original list that he had hanging up in the kitchen of what I would argue was his core values. Also, I'm probably going to get comments about this. I don't think you can buy this book. If I find it, I will post a link in the description. This was a gift to staff in 2010. And so happy holidays from Chef Thomas Keller. Signed my copy, which is really, really cool. But it's here on page 47 of the French Laundry side. It says, another feature on the wall is Keller's manifesto surrounded by Michelin stars. It says memories, integrity, challenges, high expectations, experience, legacy, impeccable, and never say no. And so I say that not as a gotcha moment of like, oh, look, the values were different at one point in time. It's like to share with you that this is a constantly iterating and changing process. This grows and matures with the organization. And last quick thing, if you've done the consolidating and combining things together and you have all the descriptors underneath each of the values and you're still stuck, I find it helpful to kind of take a look at the list of values and look at things like respect and responsibility and integrity and really ask yourself, like, is there a world where someone would value the opposite of this? An example of this is like the early Facebook days of move fast and break things. This is one of those ideas of certain companies value kind of like safety and, making sure that we're going slow and being collaborative and all of these sorts of things. Facebook actually didn't value that in the early days, but that was really helpful in attracting the right type of person to go work at Facebook at that time. And that's the reality, is that when you're laying out your values, you're saying, given the choice between this and this, I'm going to choose the one that aligns more with my values. So I hold one in higher regard than the other. And so, yeah, your organization might grow to the size and scale and complexity of Thomas Keller's someday. But I think in those early days, it can be beneficial to kind of like narrow it down to 1, maybe 3 max, and then roll forward with that instead of this list that is, just a little bit hard to wrap your head around.
What are you doing here?
What am I doing here? Hold on, it's coming to me. Oh yeah, I remember now. I own the place. So whatever the fuck I want.
Sorry.
What's that?
Cryovac.
Why do we need a new cryovac?
Well, it's a better cryovac.
Better how?
What are you asking me?
To stop spending my fucking money. Don't think I'm not seeing these fancy new earthenware fucking
Heard,
hippie plates.
thank you.
3 things there. 1, when you have investors for your restaurant, you are beholden to those investors. And so that's why certain chefs choose to either bootstrap or do crowdfunding that we've seen in the past, because I think that there's this idea of, I don't want to be beholden to whatever else somebody wants, or again, have someone be able to barge in and ask me questions at any moment. And that's what's ultimately playing out here, is that as the executive chef, I've kind of talked about this in other videos, is that you kind of get a barrage of questions when you, most often, like the first time you become a sous chef is when that really kind of like happens to you, when front of house is asking you stuff and your line cooks are asking you stuff and the purveyor comes in and starts to ask the thing, and then the owner's, son comes in and asks a question about something. So it's not the right or wrong answer, it's just a trade-off that you kind of have to acknowledge as you open a restaurant. Secondly, on the cryovac machine thing, I think there are 2 kind of, key features that do make certain cryovac machines better than other. One is capacity, and then the other one is speed at kind of like getting things vacuumed. Based on the dimensions of the cryovac machine, some actually, because they're wide enough, you have the ability to like maybe do 2 bags at once based on whatever your vacuum sealing. Or maybe there's actually one where you can have a bigger bag, and then instead of doing, these beets cryovac'd in this way, and we usually had to do 8 bags a day, because of this new cryovac machine, we only have to use 2 bags a day. And then on the speed front, if you've ever been tasked with cryovac all of these, insert thing, protein, vegetables, dry goods, you have the ability to go faster because of the, cryovac machine doesn't take as long to kind of like do the pressure regulation and then ultimately get all the air out, then you can actually move through that project faster. That's a direct labor cost savings. And so I know this Carmen getting berated needed to play out for TV here by the owner, but it's just something that if he would have been able to voice that, especially in this context, I think he maybe would have saved himself that feeling of getting roasted by the owner. And then lastly, you heard Carmen say heard. I had a whole rant that I went on and published as a standalone video on the channel about why I don't say heard in professional kitchens, and potentially an alternative if you want to cue that up next after you get done with this episode.
Your shit, break down all boxes before putting them in dumpster. No surprises. Never repeat ingredients. Technique spelled wrong, but whatever.
Another perfect example, breakdown boxes. That is a rule. That is like a standard operating procedure, maybe is a way to call it. It's not a value. Rules or constraints or the way we do things might be a reflection of the values. That's ideal, but it doesn't end up being something that ends up going on this exhaustive list of 18 different things that every single person has to be able to remember. At some point in shooting this scene, this container changed direction, and I know that because I was looking at the tape in both of these scenes, and I can't unsee it.
We're gonna get a star. What?
I thought that was a trap.
I thought we were gonna be dialed.
Okay.
I very distinctly remember the meeting as a sous chef sitting there, and my executive chef tells everybody we're going to go for the star this year. And it is that, kind of shift that you have to experience, because the status quo, what you have been doing, has not led to this recognition, this award. And so things have to change in order for us to be able to, have that perception ultimately changed about us by the Michelin guide. And so Carmen's talking about subtraction. He's talking about pushing because he has those things drilled into him from his experience of working for Chef David. But that kind of comes back to what I talked about in last episode of like, decide what's going to change here. And that's the thing. There's no right answer here. That's why it's, decision making is difficult, because if there was one right path path and all of us could just cook the same recipes and open the same style concept and copy the playbook, then everybody would have Michelin stars and they wouldn't mean anything. But yeah, as much as like I didn't mean to pause on the Sydney eye roll moment here, it can be that. It can be that feeling of like, we have all these changes that we have to do and I don't necessarily know if this is going to be the right decision or lead to the stars down the line. But I'm going to make the argument that it is actually better to do something like this and proactively decide you're going to go for the stars rather than to just like be more passive and just kind of like cross your fingers and hope that it happens. And then on the day of the stars coming and being announced, it's like, oh, we missed the list again. That turns into something where you're ultimately disappointed. Whereas if you do this and you actively make those changes, you can, reflect back on that and say, okay, well, this was a little bit too much, or, this actually caused these complexities or operational, hurdles down the track here. What if we actually shifted this and then that might actually get the attention or, move us closer to achieving that goal?
We're gonna change everything every day.
Yes. I made a list, Sugar.
Why?
So they can see what we're capable of.
Who's they?
Can Tina do farmer's market?
Probably, but you didn't answer my question,
And
though.
there's a DocuSign in your inbox.
Carmy,
See that?
no, saying what?
It is a partnership agreement. You, me, Nat. There's a vetting schedule.
Vesting.
Oh my goodness, so much information there. I'm feeling overwhelmed. So let's go through the quick ones first. So I'm going to pop up on screen a couple examples of restaurants who do the farmers market program. I'm going to highlight a couple that are mostly in New York because they have the Union Square green market that happens. Sometimes it's the executive chef that goes there, and then that's ultimately going to dictate what the menu for the week is. But it's more often than not what's happening here, where, you're delegating their market responsibility to someone in the organization that is going to, has some sort of leadership capacity where they can make those decisions and actively make sure that we're like not overpaying for things at the market. Again, not repeating ingredients, like this isn't represented somewhere else in the menu or too similar to something else. And then it's also going to like stay within cost and we're not, spending exorbitant amounts, or maybe even like have the relationships at the market where those can ultimately make sure that we're like getting a good deal or supporting our homies. We'll see how it plays out for Tina in future scenes where like she comes in with this cart of a bunch of different boxes, and that's really kind of how it works. It's like a big wagon, or you borrow somebody's car and just load up the back of somebody's SUV with all of the ingredients that you want to have. Because yeah, for better or for worse, these small independent farms that have like the really high quality whatever, insert the piece of produce that they might have, they don't have the infrastructure to do the delivery to all of the different restaurants around town, and so they take advantage of the farmers market to just come to one central place. And if you want the mustard greens from me, you and your team have to come to me. I will still give you the preferential pricing because you're a corporate account or something like that. Then that allows that small farmer or that independent organization to ultimately make sure that they're doing business well in a way that is not able to compete with like the big produce people who have the big vans and trucks that drive around the whole city. Secondly, 2 thumbs up for Sydney actually getting a formalized partnership agreement from the Bear restaurant in her inbox. We will talk about that, I think, as more specifics for that partnership agreement come up on screen, but kind of a nod back to season 2 when we were talking about, she's talking to her friend. She's like, oh, well, we're partners, or this is a profit share thing. Or it's like, yeah, but I'm not quite on the ownership team. I'm not an owner yet. It's like, oh, like that's a little bit of a red flag here. Having it in writing, having it, you're potentially hiring a lawyer to go over this stuff for you can be really, really helpful as you're entering into these opportunities in your career. And lastly, the biggest piece of information that directly impacts Sydney's day-to-day is the daily changing menu, because we've seen in other seasons where she struggles on the dish creation side to really lock something in. The development side ends up having a lot of frustrating moments for her. And so, oh my goodness, what is that feeling of like every single day we have to do this? I am finally just comfortable with what our opening menu was. And now you're saying that this is like, oh, what a feeling to have that dropped on you. I did want to talk about some of the practical implications and how that plays out. I see daily changing menus as typically panning out in one of 2 ways. The first way is the kind of like least scalable version of this. And I have an example here from the Lestrant's book, Weird Flex. This actually is like a crazy expensive book now. I was looking on eBay to kind of share this with one of you folks, and I was like, oh my goodness. This catalogs the work of Christophe on the front of house side and Chef Pascal Barbeau at 3 Michelin starred Lestrant's in Paris. And it talks about this like hyper personalization that they do. There's a line here where it says, every day is different. Every client is different. We like this constant difference, this perpetual movement from one service to another, from one moment to another. We don't have time to grow old, to settle into habits. We are never bored. And this is important because if we are bored, you will be too. Lestrant's is always a surprise. The day we are no longer able to surprise you, we will have to find a new profession. And it even says that on the back of the book here. It says it became one of the first restaurants to operate without a menu, offering only surprises from the chef. And it talks about in some of the other pages about this idea of like, oh, well, this woman came in and she was wearing this dress, or she was telling us about how she's an actress or something like that. I can't remember the exact specifics. And so we tailored the menu to kind of like go in alignment with that or something like that. So it was like this is only 25-seat restaurant. And so they had the ability to work like that. The other person that comes to mind that really does this in a really beautiful way is my old mentor, Chef Danny Calvert at Seisan in Tokyo. They've gotten some crazy awards in the past, few years, and they're really on the track, like in my opinion, to get 3 Michelin stars very, very soon. But he does this too, where he will, tailor the menu, and it's mostly based on the like low availability of ingredients, where he was only able to get so many pieces of fish. And it's not this instance of like, oh, well, we're going to omit things from your menu and certain tables are going to get the nice stuff and you're only going to get this stuff. He actually makes sure that you get a well-constructed full experience. And there are signature dishes that obviously have their placement in the menu, but I think that that's one version of an ever-changing menu every single day. The other example of this is that the menu is the menu, that you can come and eat on Thursday. If you come back and eat on Friday, even the very next day, you're going to have a different menu experience. But that menu almost works like a template, and every single guest in the dining room gets that. And the chef de parties that are working that station are prepping like 110 of that for that particular evening. A bunch of restaurants do this. The one that's most easy for me to talk about is the French Laundry per se experience. And so that typically has this structure that I'm going to put up on screen now. The way that I'm structuring this in Satisfying Dish Creation, waitlist for that in the description, is through a concept that I call Mad-Libbing the menu. So if you've ever played Mad Libs, it's this idea of like there's a paragraph and there's certain spaces that are missing, but Mad Libs does a really good job of basically giving you suggestions on what type of word to put in that placeholder. And if you'll notice, these menus function very similarly. The ingredient or the type of protein ends up being the placeholder. And so based on the ways that the menu needs to flow, from going from lighter ingredients to heavier ingredients, or like we're not going to serve the lobster after the beef, so like that needs to kind of be earlier in the menu, or even to make sure that you don't end up having a menu that like omits something like a salad or like omits a signature dish and just like completely goes over somebody's head. This is like the standard operating procedure for how the menu gets created every day. And it is that very collaborative process at, again, like 12:30, 1 in the morning, where you're going around the table and all the chef de parties are saying, like maybe we should do lubina, maybe we should do halibut here for the fish. And you go around and suggest some vegetable garnishes or the sauces, and then ultimately you might say, okay, we're going to do tomato, but how are we going to do the tomato? That dictates, exactly what preparation is going to be needed. That dictates the ordering, and then that goes in for the night, and then you come back the next day and you execute on whatever you decided. The reason I like the Mad Libs way of explaining this is because when you need to put an adjective into the Mad Lib, effectively what you're doing, you're pulling it from your brain, but what you're really doing is you're pulling a word from something called the English dictionary. There are pre-existing words that have meanings, that have definitions, that have implied contexts, that have, all of the grammar, kind of well-defined, the way that it's spelled, the way that the intonation goes, putting the emphasis on the right syllable. Those specifics are well-defined. It's the same as what we saw in episode 1, that recipe binder that Carmen is able to pull a recipe from. If you have that infrastructure, you can change the menu every day in a Mad Lib style fashion. You can change the menu every day without that, but then it turns into a situation where the person working that station, it better be super dialed in on whatever that happens to be, and there has to be direct agreement and alignment with Carmen's vision for the thing, whatever that dish needs to look like, or Carmen needs to be the one that's working the station. The reason, in my opinion, that Sydney feels so overwhelmed in this situation is because the language has not been created yet. It's almost like if you've ever been like a, J.R.R. Tolkien fan, and he had to come up with Elvish as a language in order to, have it be integrated into the songs and the dialogue of the Lord of the Rings books. That is that situation where the language isn't created yet, and so coming up with a Mad Lib is really hard because you don't have the dictionary yet. Rene Redzepi talks about this. I brought this up in individual videos too, where as he does a lot of the R&D process, he's coming up with new letters that he can use to actually make sentences with in the future. I think it's a beautiful way to kind of like articulate this, and I kind of co-opted some of that in this Mad Lib analogy that I draw with creating a menu and dish creation. And I say this because if you have goals like this for your restaurant or your pop-up or whatever it is that you're doing, I just want you to be aware of how other people do it so you don't have these frustrating moments or like, oh, I don't want to go for this because it seems too hard. It's totally possible. There's just a lot of work required and infrastructure needed to be built in order to have this be a potential viable option for yourself and your creative output.
Okay, I don't have a lawyer. I think I know one.
Yes, you do.
Who?
Pete.
Okay. constantly evolve through passion and creativity of the place. Is that what you think mise en place means?
Good morning, team. How's everybody feel?
I think I've covered it in other videos, but she brought up that point about finding a lawyer, having a lawyer look at this. And I just think back to like the stories I've covered from an industry news perspective about like contracts not getting adhered to, or like chefs just getting screwed over in one way, shape, or form. I mean, she kind of joked about AI, but like, and obviously ChatGPT is not a substitution for a lawyer, but like I find it helpful to like just run a legal document or a contract through ChatGPT and be like, explain this to me in different terms. And obviously it's going to, like potentially hallucinate. So you obviously like not a substitution again for a real lawyer taking a look at some of this stuff. But like if it's a family friend, if it's some person in your, network that has the ability to look at this, look at it like insurance on the decision that you're going to make. Because if you're making this for financial upside or ownership percentage, or you're hoping to, be a part of this for the long term, it is a worthwhile investment to make sure that at least all your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed. Because, there's just too many examples of people not having this looked at, or, ultimately getting screwed over because, this person, doesn't have the ability to lawyer up. And, there's all sorts of predatory behavior that happens. And so if you're watching this, I know that, similar to what Sydney's talking about, it can be this thing where like, I don't want to ask for help, or I'm not the type of person to go ask for a lawyer. Like this is the time, this is the step up in your career where it is actually like you do become the person who needs to find a lawyer. And I just have had moments in my career where I wish I would have sought legal counsel, and I have not. And so again, if this can be a moment of you getting the lesson without the scar, I want to take that and give it to you. Also, like funny haha elbow nudge to Sydney's joke talking about of the place and being mise en place, but we'll take what we can get with the writing here.
It looked like the person who had done it previously had never left the city of Chicago.
I can leave the city of Chicago out of it.
Zero flow, no efficiency, looked like shit, so I thought I'd give you a hand.
This is an interesting dynamic. I'm not going to say it's right or wrong or one way or the other, but I do think that it's funny that, like the chef goes out into the dining room and makes changes on the dining room side. But you will rarely see the dining room person coming in and like tweaking the spices that are going into, a particular cure or something like that, and making a suggestion in that way. And so, yeah, there is obviously this, hierarchy almost of decision making that can happen. And yeah, when it goes wrong or somebody feels disrespected, or you're the Sydney in this role and you're watching this play out in real time in front of you, and again, mom and dad are fighting in that situation, can be kind of awkward.
We have to remember a whole menu every day.
What, you can't learn a new menu every day?
Stick up for yourself.
I could.
You can, Neil.
Absolutely, we could learn a new menu.
I mean, we talked about the culinary infrastructure required for a daily changing menu, but fact's right. The front of house has to be briefed and informed and understood on all of the ins and outs of what that new menu is, so that they can explain when a guest asks a question, what's in the sauce here, that it isn't this awkward interaction of, okay, I need to go ask the chef what's in the sauce here, which is why you'll usually see this in the more operationalized businesses that are bigger and have the big recipe libraries, or you'll see it with, the chef and the front of house person who have been working together for like 5+ years, and they know every trick up each other's sleeve. And then that person has the ability to say, okay, I know this chef's repertoire well enough where I have the ability to look at something that's on the plate and I say, oh yeah, I know what that is. But then even beyond the front of house explaining, what about the wine pairing side? Like, do we have enough of a deep inventory of a cellar to be able to actually pair if we're doing wine pairings, or even if we want to be able to offer a wide range of things depending on if proteins are changing or sauces are changing or ingredients, as the seasonality changes is a little bit different. That's required to deliver a really good experience. And then even on the plate side, this has a broth that's poured table side now all of a sudden because we changed the menu again. Do we have enough stuff? I remember the big, like garage basically of plateware and serviceware, and they're all like plastic wrapped every single day as they, come out, and the chefs decide, what are we going to plate this on today? You have the decision as a chef de partie to say, I want my dish to be plated on this today. And then front of house does the work of, that's why the big team exists, to be able to come in, unwrap everything. If we need to, decide to go run it through the dish machine today, like that's why all those hands exist in these big organizations. What about typing up and printing the menus? Because if you're going to spend all this money to come to this place, you're probably going to want a little memento to walk away with. I almost forgot the sourcing side. Do we have enough purveyors that have enough variety in a particular season to give us enough of a change in things to make sure that we can actually change the menu every single day? There's just so many questions that, like, yes, even the culinary side is such a titanic ask of, do we have the ability to change the menu every day? But then all the other ramifications and how this plays out across the whole team after we make this call that we're going to do this.
Tipping issue?
Service charge.
Or added tip.
Yeah, it's 9 courses, so $175 plus tip.
Thank you.
Fine.
Good. Richie? Good?
Don't.
You can say it.
No, don't say
Yeah,
it.
please
Yes,
don't say
you
it.
can say it.
Don't say it.
Actually, I think it's a good price.
Great.
So carry on. Still fuck you.
$175, not too far off from the numbers that we talked about in episode 10 of season 2 on opening night, where I would put up the whole floor plan and we talked about what potential some of the numbers were. I'm going to link that video if you want to go check it out. But what I was interested in to hear your folks' thoughts on is tipping in this situation, because that has become a quite contentious topic. There are all sorts of schools of thought on this, with being service included, automatically adding a surcharge, having to give a description of what the surcharge is for. It's something that it seems like everybody has a different answer around. And again, it's one of those funny things where there is no right answer, but I don't think that we have come to a kind of generalized consensus where everybody has kind of moved towards one direction. There have been experiments that have been run. There have been things that haven't worked. And I'm mostly curious to hear, because I've never worked in an organization where the tips go to the kitchen team. And so if that has been beneficial for you, or you have seen some sort of like upside there, I'd love to know in the comments. And so that's my question of the day for you folks, if you would be so kind to leave me your thoughts to read through. The last point on the $175 price tag, and what's interesting to me, I've fallen victim to this too, I've done this way too many times in my career, is like pulling that number out of your ass kind of thing. Where did that come from? Like, where was the costing work that went into picking out that number? And I think that can often be where chefs fall into, where it's like, do a gut check and research a couple other restaurants. What's so-and-so charging for their thing? How many courses are they doing? And it never ends up working out that way from an actual P&L perspective until you get to the end of the month, and then you can all automatically say like, oh, here are where our costs landed. And it's not even about ingredients. It's about labor. It's about like, what other sorts of operational things do we need to pay for? What profit have we factored in? And that's another thing that becomes incredibly difficult with a daily changing menu, is that you don't have, because the price, unless you're going to have a dynamic price that changes every single day, depending on what proteins you're having in that day or what produce the person happened to need to substitute for you, it ends up being really, really difficult to ultimately come to a satisfying conclusion. And where this became painfully obvious for me was in my externship at Per Se. I had to do an externship manual. We had all these worksheets that we had to, submit, and writings we had to do, and interview the chef on these specific things. And one of the tasks was to cost out a dish. And I was basically given this answer of like, shrug your shoulders when I was like, hey, I want to take one dish from the tasting menu, which has one rolled up price, right? At the time, I think it was like $275 for the tasting menu. And it was like, I want one dish on this menu to be costed. And it's like, that's not actually how it works. Like, you can obviously get the insights for what the ingredients of this cost, but it's absolutely not the case where just because this is one dish on a 10-course tasting menu, this is 1/10 of the pie chart of the cost of this whole menu. Different courses have different ingredients that have different labor associated with them that to have different costs. And so what most of these organizations typically do is they'll do like a month end or quarter end analysis of kind of like revenue compared to expenses. And in organizations where I have worked, different members of the leadership team might have different, costs that are under their purview. So you as the sous chef, you make the schedule, you're in charge of labor cost. Or you as the sous chef, you're in charge of ordering, you're in charge of food cost. And ultimately what goes along with that is like, you're typically the one that's standing at the pass every night, making sure that like not too much waste is happening throughout the day. And we're not even talking about like consumer psychology and how they think about prices, and like how you can potentially price a little bit higher to give a more air of, higher end or luxury, versus like if you have something that's a little bit too cheap, that can actually, hold a different place in a consumer's mind. And again, $175, that's just talking about the tasting menu. That's not talking about supplements that might be added on that we've covered in episode, I think 7 or 8 of season 2 when we were talking about forks. That's not even factoring in beverages. We see that they're clearly making investments into wine education here so that they can ideally build out that program. And so there's all sorts of factors that go into this.
Look, I know that list probably looks crazy.
That's me.
So sick. What a sick response from Marcus. Like the development that this guy has had going from season 1 now into season 3, where he's like unfazed by, these changes and these adjustments. Like, this is what's awesome to have in a chef de partie, or, obviously he's the pastry chef in this situation, but like he's running a station and he's getting thrown like a new menu and he's saying, yeah, I got this. Like, I'll figure it out. Like, I know that I talked about the concept of TSD, Total Station Domination, in the context of like Carmen's super put together organized station, but this is really what it looks like when you have like all your ducks in the row and you have your habits internalized, and it's like, I call this new menu, no disasters. And so like what I get psyched when I see somebody go through TSD and they get to the end and they can share that like, hey, chef changed the menu this week and I was kind of unfazed. Like, this is that played out. Like, if I had to make a commercial for Total Station Domination, it would just be those 2 lines. Like, I know these changes or whatever. And it's like, not to me.
Yeah, name it.
Take us there, Bear.
I'm like debating doing spoilers right now because I feel like this show has been out long enough. The season has been out long enough where I feel like I can talk about some of the later episodes in the season. But what we're going to do is we're going to leave a pin in this phrasing because Take Us There, Bear gave me goosebumps. It was one of those situations where I watched this scene and I was like, oh my God, we're about to see like, again, another Super Saiyan moment from Carmen here, or maybe even like the whole team ends up coming together in some cool way. So I'll put a pin in this conversation. I want to talk about it in episode 10 in how it relates to how I thought about this whole season. But just remember this conversation. My name is Justin Khanna. Thanks so much as always for your attention, and I hope you have a good one.